Early June in upstate New York. It's a really beautiful time. It's finally consistently warm, and the trees are a dreamy light green color of new leaves. On the morning of June 5th, 1909, a middle-aged woman stands next to the railroad tracks under the sunlight streaming through those light green leaves. In the distance, she sees the lumbering Erie train number 2 making its way to the small-town train station where she's waiting, with her trunk filled with her best clothes. She made sure to pack her very best. When the train stops in front of her with a cacophonous squeal of the brakes, she confidently boards the vessel and settles into the nearest car as they begin to move again with a lurch. Silently, the woman says her goodbyes to the passing countryside outside of her window. She won't be back here again. Then, on the morning of June 8th, 1909, a young woman picks up her morning newspaper while she picks at her breakfast. It's another beautiful June morning, and the cool wind is blowing gently in through an open window and ruffling the sheer white curtains. The young woman flips through the newspaper distractedly. She has bigger things on her mind today. But a picture catches her eye and causes her to stop. There in the middle of page 7 of her morning paper is a picture of the corpse of a recently deceased, unidentified woman. But the young woman reading the newspaper immediately identifies her. It's her mother. I'm Karen Harding, an amateur genealogist, and I've spent an embarrassing amount of time and money unlocking the stories of the people who had to exist for me to exist.
And I'm Kim McMasters, a millennial with no interest in history, having kids, or leaving a legacy of my own.
And you're listening to Low Ancestry. Each episode, I'll share one story from my family tree with Kim, proving that ordinary people like me, with ordinary ancestry like mine, have compelling and sometimes scandalous or heartbreaking stories buried within them. Welcome back, Kim.
Welcome back, Karen.
We're back for our something of a part 2, talking about the same 3 generations of the same family. And we're talking about the younger generation today. But today we have a very sobering story. And before I get going, this episode talks about suicide. So if you or someone you love are struggling with suicide ideation, please give this episode a skip. Also, we will have the National Suicide Prevention information in our show notes. You can reach them by dialing 988. So although our story is a heartbreaking one today, there's another story inside of our story that's about resilience and hope, I think. And
prove it.
I will. And I think those 2 stories give us a portrait of a very complicated family and maybe shows us how commonplace a complicated family of this might be. As a reminder, today's episode is continuing off the story of Frank and Helen Dewey, my 4th great-grandparents, where we learned that Frank's wife hadn't been as dead as he claimed. And
Just a little bit underdead.
Underdead. Like underproved?
Yeah.
Okay, good. And how Helen bore that hardship, like she had bore being a young mother with a husband off at war and bore raising all of these children to adulthood. Today, I'm going to continue that story as that family struggles their way through into the 20th century. And we look first at Frank and Helen's daughter-in-law, Carrie Dewey. Her maiden name is White.
Okay.
And then their granddaughter, Cora May Dewey, later named Cora Hargrave. But to get to either of these women, we got to talk about Frank and Helen's son, their second son, Frederick Dewey.
Why do we always have to go to men to
I
get to the
know,
women?
because that's where all the information is. Ugh. But this will be a quick detour because he wasn't that especially interesting.
Good. We don't need anybody else marrying a 13-year-old.
Interesting men. Fred was born in March 1861, as we talked about, the same month as Abe Lincoln was sworn into office. His father joined the Union Army, heads off to war for 3 years, so he might not have noticed that his pop was gone for that time, but not for nothing, Fred's early years were formed by this absence and the war raging around the country. So Fred grew up in a large family. We talked about this last episode, but he had 9 other siblings, of which he was the second born. And of his 9 siblings, 8 of them were brothers, with only the one sister.
A nightmare.
The dates of the birth range from 1859 to 1882, 1882 being the year where the only daughter was born, actually. So she was the youngest as well.
Mm-hmm.
I actually didn't think about this when I wrote the last episode, but maybe the reason Helen had so many children is because she just was like, this one has to be
Just like, please be a girl.
like, this one has to be a girl. and then once she had the girl, she's like,
said,
I'm out. I've done what I can do here.
You know, I have a hard time believing that anyone would hope for a girl back then.
True. I mean, true.
But we like Helen. Helen's a good egg.
But I mean, we learned that Helen spent her last years living with her daughter. So maybe she was just looking for someone reliable to live with.
Yep. She was playing
and it's
the long
always
game.
the women. So Fred grows up in Delaware County, New York. We've talked about this before. And by this time, he is 19 and an adult when he's still living with his family, working as a farmhand on his father's farm. That's according to the 1880 federal census. But it's not until 4 years later, in 1884, that he marries a woman named Carrie O. White. Carrie White was born in 1864 on the other side of Delaware County, about 30 miles away. She was born to Ezra and Catherine White. And like a lot of women's stories in genealogy, we only know that she spent her youth in this one town called West Davenport until she married Fred. That's all I know about her. So in 1884, she's 20 years old. She marries Fred, and almost immediately they start to have children.
Let's just all take our time.
Let's just
Let's just take our time, take a breather. Why do we got to go so fast?
I mean, this is pre-contraception.
Oh my God, that's such a good point.
Thank you.
Okay. Egg on my face.
Yeah. First is Maud in 1885.
Good name.
The second name?
Is it like Hazel?
Claude. Maud and Claude.
Come on.
So Maud in 1885 and Claude in 1887.
Incredible.
Good work, Carrie. Good work, Carrie.
10 out of 10.
So shortly after when they got married, in 1887, actually, when Claude is born, the White family experiences a horrible tragedy. Carrie's older brother, William Wallace White, and yes, that is a killer name.
Yeah.
Named after Scotland's hero. And then the initials are WWW.
Yeah.
Which, come on, ahead of their time. So in 1887, William was working in the forest near his home when a dry limb falls down on him, crushing his skull. He lives a few more days after the accident, and one article actually states that the doctor literally took off part of the skull where it was dented and took pieces of wood out of William's brain, and he lived a few days after that.
Whoa!
So there was even a moment after the operation that they thought William might like make it through.
Holy moly.
But it wasn't to be. And at the age of 22, William Wallace White succumbs to his injuries.
Oh, devastating.
Really devastating. And the one news article that describes the incident also says that William's aging father and mother lived with him and relied on him.
Ugh.
It states, quote, Mr. White was the prop on which his aged mother and father rested.
Oh, no. Oh, God.
Isn't that so sad?
Oh.
Carrie's parents actually pass away not long after William's death. And I don't have a date for Catherine's death.
Of course you don't. Why would you?
Why would I? But context clues surrounding Ezra's death, it sounds like she actually had already been gone by the time he dies.
Oh.
So somewhere between William's death and Ezra's death, she died. So that's within like less than a year or at least around a year. In both cases, I actually wasn't given a cause of death for either Ezra or Catherine, so I don't know, but it's not great that their son died and then they immediately died after. So that means Carrie loses her brother and her parents all within a year.
Oh, that hurts.
It's really hard. Shortly after her father's death, in September, Ezra dies in May. She gives birth in September to my second great-grandmother, Cora May. And I know I'm going to sound a little woo-woo saying the next bit. I'm going to sound like one of those like energy girlies.
Yeah.
But I sort of believe that there's like some symbolism around like all of this intense grief around Carrie and then Cora May just immediately being born
Yeah.
during this like surrounding grief.
Sure.
It sounds really intense and sad, and I guess I'm foreshadowing really not subtly. So Carrie has Cora, and then she has 2 more children after Cora. There's a 5-year difference between when Cora is born and when the next child is born, whose name is Flora.
I was just about to ask, like, do you think that she tried to find something to rhyme with Claude and then she just
ran
started
out. She ran out, and so she started over.
Oh, that's so good.
Carrie, good job. So that was in 1893, but unfortunately, the next tragedy of Carrie's life is that Flora dies in infancy at less than a year's old.
This is too much grief for one woman.
It is. It's exactly too much grief for one woman. I note the 5-year gap between Cora and Flora's birth because in genealogy, that's always something you want to notice. Before contraceptive, preventative measures, this information does actually give you some insight into what's happening in the family. So
what does it say?
So for example, a large gap between 2 children might mean the parents weren't having sex, they were apart from each other, or they just weren't having it, which would probably say that these were like difficult times.
Yeah.
2, Carrie might not have been able to get pregnant during this time, which at her young age may have been something upsetting to her. Or 3, Carrie was getting pregnant, but maybe none of them made it to term, which is also very upsetting.
Yeah.
So those are our 3 options of why that would happen. I think no matter the reason, to have the first child after that 5-year gap die in infancy, I could imagine would be a really terrible thing.
Yeah.
2 years later, though, Carrie has her last child, Mary, in 1895. Also,
Carrie and Mary.
Mary rhymes with Carrie. Does that just make you want to die?
I love it so much.
It's so sweet.
Oh my gosh.
And Mary does live into adulthood.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yeah.
Whew.
Over the next decade, the Dewey family grows up, and we don't know what, if anything, really happened during that time. They live mostly in Sydney, New York, which we've talked about. But in the year 1900, according to the federal census, the family lived briefly in a town called Unadilla, New York, which is in the next county over, which I mentioned for no reason at all. For Cora...
Wait a second.
No, it'll come back. It'll come back. So for Cora, she becomes a teenage girl. It looks like by the age of 16, she had finished schooling and was living at home in 1905 back in Sydney, New York. So 1900s, they were in Unadilla. 1905, they were back in Sydney. And I'm going to show you a picture of Cora. I think this is when she's a young woman, but I think it still fits. Do you want to describe Cora to me?
Oh, she's beautiful. She's really pretty. She's got very soft features, very bright, promising eyes. I don't know. Is this creepy to describe it this way?
No, that's how I think of her.
Her hair is up in a shape.
It's like pulled back, but in that old timey way.
Yeah, but in that old timey way where it's like kind of loose and big about it. I think she's gorgeous.
Yeah.
She looks very young.
Yeah, she is. And I think this picture I always like because it's similar to Helen in some ways. Like Cora has this like kind of smile about her.
Yeah, there's like a wee twinkle and like literally
like a personal joke.
Yeah. The very left corner of her mouth is just like slightly upward.
Slightest upturn.
It's very cute.
Yeah. My grandma loves this picture. She shows it to me all the time.
It's gorgeous.
And she just says, doesn't she look like the sweetest person?
She does look very sweet.
She looks very sweet.
It's a face that you would feel comfortable approaching.
Yeah.
There have been some unsavory characters on this pod.
There have been faces on here that we wouldn't even come within 100 feet of.
No, not at all. And she looks like one that you could trust. She's an ally.
Yeah, you can tell. Then in October 1907, just a month after my girl Cora turns 18, she marries a man named William Hargrave, who lives in Unadilla, New York. So I never heard any story about how the two of them met. Presumably it was when the family was living in Unadilla. William was a blacksmith back there. And this is what he looked like.
Oh, no. Oh, he's handsome.
Look at those muscles.
Oh, my goodness. He's so handsome. So in the picture, his biceps look quite large, but it also looks like he's pushing them up with his fists
100%.
He's very handsome. It's actually funny enough giving Anthony Bridgerton.
Oh.
A little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
Smiling also. Got some happy photos
Got some
here.
happy folks.
Handsome man.
Yeah, those blacksmith muscles and like the rolled up shirt over his muscles.
Come on.
He knew. He knew.
He knew. Every Pirates of the Caribbean girly is geeking out.
Can I tell you something I don't love?
Oh, is it everything about him? Because that's what I assume.
Not everything about him, except that he was 32 years old when he married Cora, which means that back when Cora was living in Unadilla, at the latest, she was 15 or 16 when they met. So, but I don't want to harp on this for too long, and I'll tell you why, which is my family speaks very fondly of William and Cora. And so I think that is not good, and I'd like to publicly be a person who says that's not good. I just want to let it be known that like everyone like really loved these two people, and especially like my great grandmother, she really loved her father and spoke very fondly of him. He was like this warm figure in the family that like helped people. Yeah. So I don't want to like go too hard to the paint just because I don't want to disrespect my family.
Sure. But
I can easily say, hey, if there's any teenage girls out there who are being approached by men in their 30s, that's not love and you should run.
Yeah, and girl, you're in danger. So
in 1908, Cora's grandfather, Frank, passes, which we talked about previously. Mm-hmm. And it's 1908, 1909 when Helen begins her like filing for claim of her widow's pension. But this ends up actually being an eventful time for Cora and William in a couple ways. For one, they actually help Helen with this process. Mm-hmm. So in Frank's pension and like the widow's pension part of it, there are letters written by William who was writing to the special examiner telling them what he had found out, because he apparently like spent time looking for Harriet Tuttle in New York to see if he could find information about her. So he had actually been sending letters to just people who knew of like one family named Tuttle somewhere. Since Helen, I don't think could write, like he was writing these letters to the special examiner. They're very sweet. So Cora and William were like, I didn't see letters from the other like grandchildren. So they were really helping out during that time.
Wow.
And also, Cora and William have their first child, Jessie, in 1908. They have a very eventful time. The pension issue isn't resolved for a few years, though, so that goes on. But outside of these events, there's something else happening in the Dewey family, and we don't have a lot of details, barely any, but something begins to happen to Carrie, Cora's mother, which is that, well, in a newspaper article written much later, the family describes it as, quote, evidences of insanity.
Oh, no.
And in family stories that I've heard from like my grandpa and stuff, they talked about how Carrie also had like strange involuntary movements, like her arms, legs, and face, alongside the evidences of insanity. That's all the information we have about Carrie's behavior until June 3rd, 1909, when Carrie goes missing. To Carrie's family, all they know is that she's gone missing. They don't have her whereabouts for 5 days. But we in the present day are able to piece together some of what Carrie was doing. From June 3rd to June 5th, we don't know where she was. But on June 5th, Carrie gets on Erie train number 2 from the west and takes it to Binghamton City Center. Our only clue about the 2 days in between the 3rd and the 5th, in my opinion, is that Carrie lived in Delaware County, which actually is to the east of Binghamton. But eyewitnesses report that she came in on the train coming from the west of Binghamton. My caveat is like, I don't have confirmation on that she was living in Delaware like since 1905. So there's a chance that the Deweys might have lived somewhere totally random in that brief span, or there's a chance that she was sent away somewhere. All we know is that she arrived in Binghamton from the west. When she arrives, she calls for a cab in Binghamton, and she's picked up by a man named Henry Crane. And Henry's story is that Carrie asked to be taken to a hotel. She says any hotel, provided the rates aren't too high. So Henry takes her to the Water Street Hotel in Binghamton at 145 Water Street, which no longer exists. I looked it up. It's either where the Boscov's department store is or the Nurchie's Pizza across the street.
Hey.
You know about Nurchie's.
Yes, I do.
I talk a lot about Nurchie's.
Yes.
So when Carrie gets to the Water Street Hotel, she actually refuses to register at the front desk, but she pays in advance for a 2-night stay with cash, so the hotel just doesn't register her. On Sunday, she takes lunch with the rest of the guests at the hotel, But when she was called to supper, she said that she wasn't hungry and she wanted to stay in her room. But when Carrie was called in the morning, she didn't answer, and a domestic working at the hotel became suspicious. So the woman went into Carrie's room, opened the door, and saw Carrie lying unresponsive, quote, partly on the bed. The domestic says that when she entered the room, she was overcome with the smell of gas, and she immediately notified the hotel proprietor. The proprietor immediately called the police and the coroner, and they came. So when the police examined the room, they find that every crack and crevice of the window had been carefully sealed, even going so far as to put a bit of cloth into the keyhole in the door.
Oh, gosh.
So the priority for the police as they examined the room was to find out the woman's identity, because like I said, Carrie did not register at the front desk. So they don't know who this woman is. So they look around the room and look at her, and they determine that she's around 45 years old with blue eyes and dark brown hair. She was wearing a white shirtwaist and a checkered shirt.
What's a shirtwaist?
I think, you know, when you watch like Anne of Green Gables or something from like this time period, they have like the white shirts that tuck into the skirts that are like very specific looking.
Yes.
I think that is probably not helpful to anyone, except it seems like it helped you.
Yeah, I got you.
So she was wearing that with a checkered skirt. It says her low shoes were black, and she wore a black collar and belt, and it was with a cheap horseshoe brooch at her throat. They called it cheap, which is just mean.
That's so mean.
Her stockings were black with a white heel and toe, and they noted that the stockings had been darned, and she wore a black and white underskirt and a short black petticoat. But there was nothing to identify her. So they looked through the trunk that Carrie had brought with her, and the newspaper article reporting on it said, quote, "It was well filled with clothing, but any mark which might serve as a clue to her identity had been carefully removed." To me, that sounds like there were name tags sewn in and like were cut out or something. The article also notes that Carrie was wearing her best clothes out of the whole trunk when they found her, and the clothes she wore when she arrived at the hotel were also in the trunk, as well as some note paper. The police find a piece of paper on the dresser, actually, that matches that note paper that they found in the trunk. And when they open it, they realize it's actually a suicide note left by Carrie. The note is not addressed to anyone, and it isn't signed. In fact, the note ends in the middle of a sentence without being finished, which is just so sad. I'm not laughing. I'm actually trying not to cry.
Yeah.
The coroner who found it noted that the handwriting, punctuation, and spelling were like poor and then proceedingly got worse.
Yeah.
So Kim, I am going to have you read the note, which they published in the newspaper.
Okay.
But I want to say that, like, again, this is a good spot to skip ahead. I will put the timestamps in the show notes so that you know when to like come back. The reason that I'm going to have you read it is because these are the only words that we will ever have from Carrie. And in like this field of study where it's excruciatingly difficult to learn about the lives of women, I consider like finding this note as like one of the most impactful like discoveries I've ever made. So it's really important to me, but it's also a little bit distressing. So we'll put the timestamps in there if anybody wants to skip it.
Good people, I am sorry to disturb you. Forgive me, but I couldn't help it. You have heard of people getting to the end of their rope, haven't you? Well, that is the case with me. Let the town bury me. My trunk they can do what they are a mind to with. My father and mother, brothers and children are dead, so there is not anyone to bury, and I have been sick and not able to work, so I will have to let the town bury me. I tried hard to earn it. I had it once, but I let a friend have it in her need, and I never got it again. But that is the way of the world. I am ashamed to do this, but I will wash and dress as I have got things I thought I would have better, but these will have to do. I thank you all, kind friends, for what you will have to do. Pray for me that God will forgive me to ... That is extremely tough.
And it feels like such an insight into who Carrie was.
Yes. I mean, just absolutely devastated to not have control over something, feeling like a burden, feeling completely alone. I mean, it's so
heartbreaking.
Oh my goodness.
So some of the things to highlight that felt important to me was, number one, Carrie says that all of her family are dead and there's no one to bury her. Specifically, she says her mother, father, brothers, and children. So in 1909, all of Carrie's brothers are alive, save for William Wallace. And the same goes for her children. All of them are alive except for Flora.
Whoa.
But I did think that, like, it's interesting that she's partially right by saying that.
Yeah.
In that, like, she's only thinking about those that she lost. And she only says brothers. She never even mentions, she has a sister,
Yeah.
Estella, who's still alive.
Yeah.
It's only the family that is gone that she recognizes in her final hours.
It does feel, by saying children, it does make me think that there were potentially other pregnancies.
I think that's a really good point, Kim. And yeah, we wouldn't know about all of them. So the second thing I want to highlight is that Carrie mentions an incident that I know nothing about, which is she tried hard to earn it. She had it once and then she gave it to a friend and never got it back. I have no context for that. I have no idea what she's referring to. But we have a sense, obviously, that Carrie's going through some version of a mental breakdown, perhaps some kind of psychosis. So although there's a grain of truth behind everything she says, I think, like, we can't know what she really means. So there probably is a grain of truth behind this thing that she says, but I'm not sure that we can take it at face value.
Sure.
And the last thing I want to talk about is Carrie's personality, which you touched on, which is like trying her hardest and not feeling like she has the control. And in her own death, she also focuses on the inconvenience of others.
Yeah.
Which is just, she politely asked the hotel staff and the town to forgive her since it's their expense.
Yeah.
And she gives them permission to take her clothes. And then she apologizes not to have nothing better to wear it, like while she's being buried. So I don't know. And even talking about the friend that she gave everything to, it just kind of shows this really kind spirit in Carrie.
Yes.
And it's really beautiful and so sad that we only learn about those things in her death. So it says a lot about Carrie. She clearly wanted to do the right thing all the time. And so for her to get to this point must have been significant.
And it must have been so difficult living day to day under whatever condition she was in and feeling that way. Like,
exactly. Exactly. So by this time, the news story about the unnamed woman who was the victim of suicide, it runs in the Binghamton Press on June 7th. And that's where they include all of this information that we just read. Her movements prior to her death, her description in the note, all of that's in the article. And they publish it in the hopes that all these details, someone will be able to identify her through all of those details. The coroner also moves the body to the mortuary where a lot of people apparently viewed it in order to identify her. No one was able to. So the next day, the Binghamton Press runs another much shorter piece on the story in order to update the public that the woman had not been identified. And they get the idea to assist in the identification to put a photograph of her as in the mortuary in the paper.
Oof.
So they run the story with the picture. It's a little distressing. Kim, I'm going to show you the picture, and I don't need you to describe Carrie because obviously that's superfluous. Like, you don't need to describe what a body looks like.
Sure.
But I wonder if you can, like, give me your reactions to looking at this newspaper clipping.
Sure. Oh gosh. Ooh. The picture is of the corpse.
Yeah.
She's laying down. And then the caption says, "Suicide victim, unknown woman who killed herself in Water Street Hotel." I cannot imagine seeing this and having even a flicker, even if it wasn't your mother or your wife, whatever, even a flicker of recognition and thinking even for a second that that's someone you know. I cannot imagine.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine. And the indignity, although I know that they were doing the best they could of having to post this picture rather than any other picture, is just heartbreaking.
That was my reaction too, was like, they were trying to be helpful.
Yes.
And it clearly is not the delicate way to do it, but they did it anyway. And the thing is that it worked. So on June 8th, 1909, when the story ran, Cora Hargrave picks up the paper to read it, and that's the picture that she sees. And she immediately recognized it as her mother. And it says in a later news article that when she saw the picture, she rushed to Binghamton. And by the sounds of the article, she went alone. And when she got there, the police showed her the contents of the trunk and then showed her Carrie's body. And Cora positively identified her as her mother. So this experience of Cora, I think, is unfathomable. As one of Carrie's very much alive children, I'm sure that Carrie's note was probably the most devastating of all.
Yes.
Cora returns back home to her family. They make preparations for Carrie's burial. And today in Evergreen Hill Cemetery in Sydney, New York, there's a headstone for Fred Dewey, his wife Carrie, and their daughter Flora. And they're all on the same headstone.
Oh, gosh.
Isn't that just...
Oh.
Anyway, heartbreaking.
Devastating.
That's the headstone. Fred is still alive at this point in the story, but that's where they're all buried right now. So for the rest of Cora's family, including Carrie's husband, Fred, they go on and live their lives. Fred actually does get married again in 1912 to a woman named Olive Bornt, which I only say because Bornt is a fun name to say.
How do you spell it?
Bornt. Bornt. And that's actually not her maiden name. That was her first husband's last name.
Oh,
but
just
Bornt. Good name.
It's a really, we need a little levity.
Yeah, and
gives
Olive is there for us.
Yeah.
So Cora and William have 4 more children, making the final number of children 5. One of them being my great-grandmother, Eloise May, which she shares the same middle name as Cora. They all live as a very normal family during these years, and it's not until the mid-1930s that Cora's family begins to notice strange behavior from her, including involuntary muscle movements in the arms, leg, and face. Unlike Carrie, Cora's family do institutionalize her once she loses what they called significant cognitive capabilities, along with the muscle movements. And they take her to the Broome County Home Hospital, which I've actually talked about on this podcast before, but it used to be called the Broome County Almshouse.
I remember this.
Yeah.
And you've been in the building or near the building.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
It was on it was where I went to college for a little bit.
Right.
So not only was August Dine there, but so was Cora Hargrave.
Wow.
So she was there for about 6 years. And while she was there, it's a very different experience than when August Dine was in there. It's become more of a hospital than a poorhouse. I don't know the details about her time there, but it's 6 years and 2 days until she passes away in 1941 at the age of 52. And on her death certificate, it says the cause of death is chorea, which is the scientific name for the involuntary muscle movements that she was experiencing. So I probably should have mentioned this before now in the series of this podcast, but my grandma, who is married to Papa, who this is his family, she's been doing genealogy for over 20 years.
Wow.
So most of this information, not all of it, but a lot of the information that I have is my grandma did a lot of that legwork. My family called it an unhealthy obsession with her. So it's proof that genetics are strong and a real thing. But the research that she did into this family, she knew that there was something that happened with Cora May, some disease that she had that they didn't recognize.
Yeah.
And she became a bit it was like a bee in her bonnet to figure out what happened to Cora May. I think because Papa's family talked about it a lot.
Sure.
And what she found out was that Cora had something called Huntington's disease. Have you ever heard of this?
Yes. I don't know the specifics, but I have heard of it before.
Huntington's disease, for those who don't know, is an incurable neurodegenerative disease, which means it causes the brain cells to break down and die. So a few of those symptoms include chorea, problems with behavior, emotion, problems with thinking, personality changes, memory lapses, depression.
Oh my goodness.
These symptoms are likely to emerge between the ages of 30 to 50 years of age. And so one of the most noted features of Huntington's disease is also that it is genetic and inherited. So when we look back at Carrie's behavior before her death, it seems pretty likely that she was experiencing Huntington's disease and she passed that genetic trait down to Cora.
Oh, goodness.
And I remember when my grandma found this out because she started freaking out and she made Papa, my dad, and my uncle all go get genetically tested because my dad and my uncle were also between the ages of 30 and 50 at this time.
Wow.
And got them all genetically tested to make sure that they didn't have Huntington's.
Yeah.
Thankfully, none of them have it, which means I don't have it and I will never give it to any children if I ever had any. So that's great that Grandma was on top of that. Thank you, Grandma. We
Oh,
are
gosh.
almost done with this story, but I do have one last plot twist.
Oh, no.
This is kind of a crazy one.
Oh, no.
I mentioned that I've seen Cora's death certificate, but I was really only expecting that information to just be about how Cora died. That was all I wanted from it.
Sure.
But I got some information that I actually can't explain, which is that, well, on every death certificate, there's a place for the person's parents' names. And on Cora's, her parents were named as Fred White and Ophelia Bennett.
What?
I know. I have never heard the names of these people.
Wait, Fred White
Yeah,
is Fred
maybe.
and Carrie White.
Right.
Combined.
So my first approach to this was, did Carrie have a brother with the first or middle name of Fred? No, it doesn't look like it. But I tried to find I went back a little ways, tried to find cousins with the name, and I couldn't successfully find anybody. I looked up Ophelia, cannot find anyone. So here's my guess, because I cannot find these people.
Yeah.
My guess is that Cora was the person who gave the information about her family to the hospital.
Yep.
And we know that Cora had a neurodegenerative disease.
Yes.
And so maybe Fred is her father's name. She remembered her mother's maiden name, White.
Sure.
Carrie's middle name starts with an O. I never found out what it was.
Oh.
It could be Ophelia. And then Bennett is Cora's sister married a Bennett. So for a lot of Mary's life, she was called Mary Bennett.
Okay.
So Cora would have heard the name. So there's a possibility here that in her affliction of this disease, she just gave names that she was familiar with.
Wow.
But then there's the other explanation, which is that those are her real parents and Carrie and Fred are not her real parents, which, I mean, the passing down of the Huntington's disease seems likely. But if her father was this Fred White character, he might have been a carrier as a white family member, of the White family. So
wow.
And to be honest, normally, you're supposed it's the most normal explanation is probably the explanation, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's true. However, this is Papa's family. And as I have said many times, Papa's family was wild and out.
Yeah.
And they were known for hiding secrets and then telling tall tales about them.
Yeah.
My grandma's so funny. Sometimes when we're talking about Papa's family, she'll just be like, oh, they always had something going on. She just,
oh, I love that.
They were that kind of family. I'll give you a specific example that's about Carrie specifically. So I had always heard since I was young that there was someone in Papa's family that committed suicide. So we'd always known that. But the story Papa had always been told was that she had jumped out of a window of a hotel.
Oh.
And the reason that she jumped was actually because she was actually Native American, and that's who her real family was this Native American family. And she was experiencing this hardship of being accepted in this white family, white community, and she committed suicide because of that.
Oh.
And when Papa would ask people in his family, his mother, she wouldn't talk about it. It was Papa's sister who told her this story, which Papa's sister had been known to tell tall tales to Papa.
Sure.
So
okay.
It was one of those situations where they would just say things.
Yeah.
But there was stuff underneath it that was true.
Sure.
And I think up until I found these newspaper articles about Carrie's story, that's actually what Papa believed happened. So this last year is the year that he actually found out what happened when I told him.
Wow.
Which is kind of crazy.
How did he react?
I think he was just kind of shocked and really I think there was something good. He just wanted to know.
Sure.
And now he did.
Wow.
So to bring it back to this strange new news of Cora, this is the sort of thing that Papa's family would hide. But these are the two options to consider. If it is the latter, if it's the second option that those weren't really Cora's parents, then all of this episode and the last episode aren't really about my ancestry at all.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy to think about? Yeah.
The logic of putting all of those names together with someone with a neurodegenerative disease, it does make a lot of sense.
It seems more likely, doesn't it?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so too. Especially with the Huntington's disease symptoms, like from Carrie to Cora, it feels pretty like on the nose.
Yeah. I mean, you started mentioning exactly the same start to this. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. Woo. Well, I mean, regardless of whether it's my story or someone else's story, I've told it anyway. Kim, do you have any resonance with this story?
It feels like it would be wild to try to wax poetic about anything right here.
Yeah.
It is all very triggering, very distressing, very, very upsetting. I'm so grateful that even between the two of them, between Carrie and Cora, there was some acknowledgement of like, oh, this is a person in need of help and in need of medical help.
Yeah.
That is like, seeing that change is incredible. And then also understanding the ways that even in my lifetime, we've started talking about mental health differently, the way there are more resources.
Absolutely.
Like, what relief, certainly too late for some, but the fact that we are getting here and we're starting to be collectively, I think, as a society, open about feelings of depression and anxiety and suicidal ideation. I mean, it is so sad to know that someone could feel like that's their only option. It is such a relief to know that there are so many resources out there should someone feel that they have the capacity to use them. The letter is gut-wrenching.
I know.
And I am so glad that we have it.
Yeah.
That we shared it. And you're right. I mean, there's a lot of speculation here, but I think from the tone of the writing, even though it is kind of plain at times, like, you can tell a lot about a human being.
Yes.
From like all of the different things that she's concerned with and all the things that she wanted to wrap up in the apologies. Like, that's a person who's mindful, even if they're not in control of their own faculties.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. It's hard to read, but I feel like this is the thing I've been beating a dead horse with all season, is like, it's hard to look back at these things sometimes, but there's just so much that comes through these like hard stories that I find so valuable. Mm-hmm. And Carrie and Cora's story is sort of the peak value that I have found in looking backwards.
There's so much anecdotal evidence with these, which I think I appreciate and I find more fulfilling or satisfying. Some of the other stories or earlier stories where we're kind of just relying on other people who are maybe not as connected to,
or as reliable
to make historical accounts of what was actually happening. So knowing that there are stories of these people that have been passed down to you, not that far away, in your family tree is very exciting and moving. And I'm glad that is available to you.
Yeah. So my resonance, I could say it again about Papa. Like, I've already done one episode though, where I like broke down crying about how Papa has broken generational curses of trauma.
Sure.
And that obviously is true in this story as well. But since I got sentimental about that already, I'll get sentimental about something else. And I think the thing that resonates with me is the relationship between Carrie and Cora. And almost in some ways, like the opposite of what I resonate with about Papa is the passing down of grief and the way that is shared between generations.
Yeah.
And what it looks like to me with all of the like facts and timeline placed next to each other is that Cora became like a lightning rod or a receptor for all of Carrie's sorrow. So like when she was, born, she was born right in the midst of all of this family grief. The child right after Cora is the child that dies in infancy. And then it's Cora, not any of the other siblings, that saw Carrie's body in the paper.
Yep.
And it was Cora who went to see her in the morgue, not any of the other children. And then on top of it all, Cora is the one child that inherits her mother's disease. In a way, like physically carrying that grief and sorrow.
Yeah.
And again, I'm going to sound woo-woo, but the connection between like mothers and daughters, I think, is a woo-woo connection.
Yeah.
That like any daughter you speak to is going to be like, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Because we carry the joys and the sorrows of our mothers. And it's why I sob at the end of the movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Oh, boy.
You know, when Michelle Yeoh's character at the end.
Can't.
Can I say it, please? When Michelle Yeoh's character tells her daughter that in all the millions of the multiverses that exist in the world, she would still choose to be here with her. Oh my God. Even if all that was possible in this universe were just a few specks of joy.
We're just a bunch of rocks.
Just a bunch of rocks. So, the romantic in me really hopes that despite everything that Carrie and Cora went through, they found specks of joy to cherish.
I'm trying to hold it together.
I know. And yeah, I hope that they they found joy through that grief that they shared together. And I think they probably did.
Yeah.
And that's my story, Kim.
Okay. Great, no problem.
It's a weepy one to go off on, but
thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing in this whole experience with me.
Oh my God.
Thanks for hearing my stories.
Don't.
Because you're perfect and I love you.
Bye.
Bye.
Low Ancestry is written and produced by Karen Harding and co-hosted by me, Kim McMasters, with original music and audio engineering by Benjamin Malk. Original cover art was designed by Christina Swanson of Swan Song Creative. Resources pertaining to today's episode and a link to the official bibliography can be found in our show notes or at our website, lowancestry.com. All research was conducted by Karen, but she's been known to be wrong on occasion. So if you'd like to connect with Karen or even send her a correction, you can email us at connect@lowancestry.com or find us on Instagram @lowancestry. Genealogy is, after all, a community effort. Thank you so much for listening, and if you like what you hear, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you, and frankly, we really need this.